Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We welcome you to the webinar on policy options for access and benefit sharing and digital sequence information on genetic resources. We're very pleased that you can join us today. We will have some opening remarks to start today. The first one will be by Mr. Basile van Havre, the co-chair of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and the second remarks by Mr. David Cooper of the Secretariat for the Convention on Biological Diversity. So without further ado, Mr. Co-chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you signal if you can see and hear me?
I can see you and I can hear you very well.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this third webinar in a series on digital sequencing information on genetic resources. Normally, I would be accompanied by Francis Ogwell, my co-chair from Uganda, but Francis is facing some family emergency and that prevent him from being with us, and he asked me to represent both of us. To begin with, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, as your participation is of great importance. There are probably only a few hundred people across the globe who have been able to engage thoroughly in DSI. And in fact, our aim is to include all negotiators, ensure all negotiators have an opportunity to participate, in the hope that we can have the best possible negotiation at the third meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group later this year, and further in Kunming at COP15. I would also like to thank the Secretariat for the work in preparing the webinar series, and as well as the member of the COP Bureau for the support. Before we start, I would like to say a few words. So it is important to keep in mind that the Conference of the Parties have asked the OAWG through Decision 1420 to make recommendation to the COP. And the COP gave us a mandate to prepare for this. As part of that, we've decided to organize a series of webinars, like I said previously, to foster a better common understanding of DSI and its importance, and the link to three other key areas of the work in this convention: the Nagoya Protocol and Sustainable Development Goals. We've asked the Secretariat to help us with this work, and their staff rose to the occasion and hosted the first two webinars in the series on December. The first one was on understanding digital sequencing information and genetic resource, and I'm sure, like myself, you learn a lot through that. And providing a technical overview of production, distribution, and use. And then on December 9, we heard from the HATEC and the process and outcome of the work that's been done under the CBD. As a result, I think what was a relatively small group of people that were engaged in the discussion grew several times to several hundreds. But that is not enough. We need to do more. In particular, Francis and I welcome the efforts and thanks parties like Norway, South Africa, the European Union, China, that have sponsored a number of very interesting events, and that gave the opportunity to many others to join the conversation on the subject. Further, we think it would be useful to continue the efforts to engage more parties with the aim of providing more opportunities to engage prior to the third meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group. So we encourage all of you and all parties to take advantage of the opportunity we have, the open dialogue, to increase understanding and facilitate discussion and crafting a path forward. We recommend that you do not wait to engage until the last minute. I think that would be a scenario that's not going to be the best, and that's going to prevent some of useful work to take place. We urge all of you also to keep an open mind and look for practical solutions. It is easy to get lost into rhetorical questions, so please look at the practical aspect. Finally, we realize that there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. And we will do all we can to advance as far as possible. even if we cannot do everything we want to do this calendar. However, as long as the path is clear and we agree on a work plan, we will have laid down the foundation for a solid success. Let's turn our attention to today. Our focus today is on exploring the options and understanding the criteria for the evaluation of the performance of these options. They all are very different. Today is not about determining the best options. We recognize that there is a need to analyze those options against the criteria, and we will work with the Secretariat and the Bureau to arrange for this. This will be an opportunity not only to review the merit of the best options, but also to evaluate what question must be answered and at what time. Finally, you and the parties among yourself will have the opportunity to make your point views and have the final negotiation when we get to open-ended working group and the COP. Please keep in mind that today's webinar is not a negotiation session. It is a briefing session on the merit of the various options. So with that, I've concluded the opening remark and pass the floor back. I don't know if it's to Charlotte or directly to David. Thank you.
I believe to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Basile, and good day, everyone. As we approach the Chinese New Year, Happy New Year also. I'm very pleased on behalf of Elizabeth Marema and all our colleagues to welcome you to this webinar on policy options for ABS and digital sequence information on genetic resources, or DSI. It's the third in a series of webinars, and this informal webinar series was developed to help build common knowledge, to level the playing field, if you like, as Basile was just saying, an understanding on DSI to support the co-chairs and the parties and observers in the preparations leading to the post-2020 framework. It's, of course, in no way part of the formal discussions on the subject. During the first webinar, held on the 1st of December and co-organized with the ABS Capacity Development Initiative, we touched upon issues relating to the production, distribution, and use of DSI. And I hope that that webinar helped to get a better understanding of some of the technical issues related to DSI. And these are obviously key to then understanding the policy options and what we may need to do to move forward towards an international agreed solution, and one that's grounded and reflects the realities of what's happening in the scientific community, in industry, and so on. In the second webinar, held a week later, we shared the outcomes of the ad hoc technical expert group on digital sequence information on genetic resources. This event, this ATEG, which took place virtually from the 17th to the 20th of March last year, of course, responded to the mandate that was set by the COP and the MOP at COP14. And I really want to thank the members of that ATEG, the experts, for the huge progress made, I think, in providing parties with an explanation of the different options and a rationale to understand those options and how they may apply when addressing the scope of DSI. And so you'll recall that they categorized DSI into different groups, which may be relevant to different policy options and to the nature of the benefit sharing approach that parties may ultimately wish to take to address the issue of DSI in the context of access and benefit sharing. The ATEG also highlighted the importance of a concerted and cost-effective international approach to digital sequence information. And the experts noted that there's a whole range of possible approaches, including measures that may kick in at the time of access, including ideas of open access with benefit sharing triggered later on by use or commercialization. Also looked at possible multilateral approaches as well as the existing approaches. The goal of the webinar today is to share information on the various policy options that have been put forward in discussions organized by partners and those that have been published in various papers. And indeed, we're very pleased to see the involvement of a number of parties and partners in moving the needle forward on these issues, commissioning studies, consulting with stakeholders, organizing informal discussions, to come up with the sort of creative policy options that the parties can then consider more formally. And as Basile just said, also, we are encouraging more parties to engage in those discussions, to be proactive, to promote more studies and papers that may contribute to this debate. At this webinar today, we're not here to analyze or evaluate these options. They haven't been vetted in any way, and it's quite possible there are other options that have been formulated but not brought to our attention. So this list might not be exhaustive, but we are doing our best here to present in an objective way and in a structured manner all of the policy options that are on the table right now as far as we are aware. And we hope that this will facilitate reflection, analysis, further dialogue among the parties, among the various stakeholders in preparing for the discussions on the post-2020 framework. And just before closing, I'd like to take a minute to look at the broader context. As has been highlighted, I think, many times last year in 2020, and in particular, the biodiversity the UN Biodiversity Summit, looking at the conclusions of the Global Biodiversity Outlook also, we know we as an international community have not succeeded in meeting the targets to reduce the loss of biodiversity. There will be an urgent need to upscale our efforts to protect biodiversity, to assure its sustainable use, and to ensure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources. And beyond increasing our efforts, we'll need to think of innovative solutions to the problems we have and to emerging issues. As time passes and DSI is not resolved, we are missing out on opportunities to create a fair and equitable system that can benefit conservation and sustainable use. So after this webinar, I'll encourage all of you to reflect on the options presented, to engage with different actors and stakeholders, so that we can build together a vision for ABS, a vision for DSI that lives up to our bold ambitions for biodiversity beyond 2020. So thanks for the opportunity to make some opening remarks, and I look forward now to an instructive webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. Thank you very much, Mr. Cooper, for these remarks. I think it's very insightful and important to remember why we're doing all this and what is the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve. I will have a little tiny thing for housekeeping. So if you have the issue of seeing a lot of small screens, but actually not seeing the presentation at a larger scale and you can't read the slides very well, you can hover over the bottom left of your screen and you will see three little different displays that are possible on this platform. Please click the middle one with a little pen on it, and the presentation itself will appear larger. and the speakers will appear on the right, but in a smaller screen. So it will be easier for you to follow and read the slides as we go. So once more on the left, bottom left corner, if you hover your mouse over it, you will see those appear. Please click the one in the middle. Very quickly, I would like to let you know about who you are, the people who registered for this webinar. These graphs were pulled out yesterday, so a few hours ago. This is not the very latest. I hope we have even more people now. But roughly, the sectorial representation, as you can see, is a lot of people from government, which is good. We are here to serve our parties, so we're happy that you are attending this webinar and taking interest in this issue. We also have a good representation from academia, who is very engaged, but also from private sector, which I'm very pleased to see is well represented as well amongst you all. And then we have representation from all other sectors that you could choose from: civil society organization, collections and museums, indigenous organizations, which is very good, intergovernmental organizations, professional and technical fields, and others, of course, as well. In terms of geography, we have large representation from North America and Europe, but also a very strong representation from Brazil and Latin America, Central America, and Mexico, which is very good. As far as Africa goes, we have, of course, South Africa, very interested and very involved partner, but also lots of countries from Southern and Eastern Africa and a few from Western Africa, which is good. I hope for these continents, at least, the translation in Spanish and French will be useful for your engagement. And so feel free to share the link to the videos afterwards with your colleagues. In Asia, we have strong representation. In Southern Asia, India is there. You can see the dark color, but also China. I want to wish everybody a very happy Chinese New Year, which is today, which I hope will bring us luck. And also Japan, you can see Indonesia, of course, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So overall, a good representation of participants. Now, to present the methodology to this webinar, I will give the floor to Mr. Shikongo from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So, Takonjo, the floor is yours.
But can you hear me?
We can hear you very well.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. My task is to take you through the methodology that we have undertaken. As you know, we started off with a webinar where we looked at understanding DSI and other technical overview of its production, distribution, and use, and then went on to have the webinar, second webinar on 9 December, which was looking at the process and recent outcomes that
Takonjo, if I could interrupt you just 1 second, could you please turn your camera off to improve the sound?
Okay.
Thank you.
Is that better? Is that better?
Yeah, I think we can hear you.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Because of, and then we then moved on from that webinar to today's webinar. I need to point out that because of time limitations during this webinar, we will not be addressing or explaining technical issues that relates to concepts, use, or usability of DSI. For more information on those aspects, we invite you to look at the recording of webinars 1 and 2, and to consult the documents considered by the ARTEC and the outcomes of the ARTEC meeting. Next slide. Next slide on methodology. Charlotte. Regarding the methodology, the goal that we set for ourselves was to have a systematize the options in a very neutral manner, and through that also to simplify them. This presentation attempts to then look at all the options put on the table by multiple initiatives and present them in a simple manner. There are a few considerations to take into account during the presentation, and these are as follows. The list of options that we'll present is not exhaustive. It is based on studies that the CBD Secretariat has been able to gather, and there could be other options that have not been explored or that we did not know about at the time that we prepared this. Options are not mutually exclusive, and a possible solution could be a combination of different options for different situations across sectors, etc. During this webinar, we will not be addressing possible modalities for sharing benefits through a multilateral fund, as this is entirely a separate discussion. The options that we are presenting here will be in a neutral manner. That means that the options are presented without any judgment on their viability in terms of the options. And to get more information and views on each option, you can consult the documents used to conduct these analysis. For instance, the report of the first global dialogue contains a list of considerations that can be used to assess each policy option. The ABS Capacity Development Initiative has prepared a video based on this preliminary list of considerations, which we believe have already been shared with you or is being shared with you. As I said, we won't look at the viability, the cost efficiency, the enforceability, and capacity requirements of the different options. And we have pointed you out where you can find the information. More information is needed on how to address issues related to the associated traditional knowledge when relevant to the utilization of DSI. Next slide. The Secretariat consulted a number of documents and papers that have been written in the last year, suggesting and analyzing different policy options for addressing DSI and ABS under the CBD. The slide provides some of the main sources of information that we used, even though we consulted many others. The list presented in the slide is not complete. In the process, we realized that there was a lot of overlap between the options that we are presenting here as we found them in the literature. Sometimes similar options are presented in a different manner or from a different angle or perspective. These presentations attempts to, as said before, systematize all the options put on the table by multiple initiatives and present them in a simple manner as we have received them at the time that we have prepared them here. Thank you, Charlotte. Over to you, Charlotte.
Yep. Can you hear me? Oh, I'm back. Thank you very much, Tauko, for this introduction on the methodology. So I'm now going to present this table. Before you launch yourself into reading every word, I want to remind you that a PDF of this presentation will be posted on our website after this webinar. So you will have the opportunity to look at this table again, print it if you need, and be able to read the details. So as Tauko was saying, as we were reading through the literature, a lot of the policies had some type of overlap, some redundancies even, and the same ideas kept coming back. And so the way we dealt with that, rather than inviting everybody to present their own policy, we have like 13 documents and many authors. It would have taken all day. So what we did is we pooled those policies into policy archetypes, if you will, sort of buckets of policies around the same idea, the same larger and higher theme. Then, in order to classify those buckets and organize them in the way that we thought was intuitive, we applied some criteria to them. Now, you have to realize that these criteria will be different for different stakeholders, different for different regions, and different for different parties. So this is what we've done. I will talk you through it, but we really invite you and each of you and each of the parties to read through those documents, take those policy options, and apply your own criteria to them in order to classify them in two buckets that makes the most sense to you and your interests. So for us and for this webinar, we have picked 6 criteria that we thought were relevant and help us take you all through these buckets of policies. So access to data is a criteria that came back a lot in the literature and seemed to be of interest to many. And so whether or not the access is regulated or not is one of the criteria we used to classify these policy. The presence of a PIC or a MAT for the policy was also of interest, mostly because it's something that's familiar to many of you and that is currently something that the parties deal with. So it was a natural criteria for us. Whether the mechanism is bilateral or multilateral is also a common way in the literature to classify those policies. And so we use that criteria as well. Whether it requires a tracing to the country of origin of the genetic resource from which the sequence was extracted and the DSI comes from is also a criteria. And lastly, whether the benefit sharing is linked to the DSI data itself or not, seemed to be something that authors were trying to think through and discuss in their papers. So we also use it as a criteria. Once more, this is not a truth. It is just one way of slicing the cake, if you will. And there are many ways of slicing that exact same cake. So it will be up to you to do your own classification and reflection around those policies. We end up with 5 large policy archetypes or buckets of policies, and we will take you through each of them in sequence in this webinar. So to start the first few lines here, I will give the floor to my colleague, Beatriz Gomez Castro from the Secretariat of the CBD. Beatriz?
Thank you, Charlotte. So you can hear me well, no? Everything okay there?
Very well.
Good morning, everybody. So now I will go through one of the first options, which is called status quo. Status quo basically means, is the description of the current situation we have now at international level. In this situation, parties have not agreed on how to address ABS for DSI of genetic resources, and that's why we are here discussing this. And the consequences of this situation is that some parties may decide to include measures on access to DSI or on benefit sharing from DSI use as part of the domestic ABS measure. Actually, this is something that, according to the fact-finding study on ABS measures that was commissioned for the ATEC, has already happened. So some countries are exercising the right to do this, to have these ABS measures in place for DSI. On the other side, for some, having open access to DSI databases is considered a sufficient form of non-monetary benefits sharing. So they consider that they are already in compliance with ABS because the benefits of having open access that can derive for more knowledge sharing for all researchers. Of course, can increase innovation, research for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So there are many benefits coming from having open access to DSI databases, and this is kind of recognized as a form of non-monetary benefit. As this is the first slide of the policy options, I want just to explain that in the lower part of the slides, you're always going to find reference to the source of this information, or where you can find more information on this policy option. So for example, in this case, is the WILDSI, known as WILDSI paper. At the beginning, there is the reference, this number 12 is the number of the paper in the information package that you have received. So it's number, and you can see what is the policy option that corresponds to this policy option within the paper. So this you are going to see through all the slides. When you can go back to consult the slides, you will be able to trace back where to find more information on each policy option. As here we are really doing a short summary. So the next one, please. So the next option is that DSI is fully integrated into the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. In this case, I mean, basically this is what could be considered like regularization of the traditional bilateral approach to ABS. How do we normally understand ABS? You know, like the typical pick and mat. And in this option, access would be regulated, always subject to each country legislation. As always, each country can decide not to regulate access, but that we are talking just about the default. Access to DSI could be regulated in a similar manner that has been access to genetic resources regulated under the CPD. So in a way, you consider, some countries can consider, and some are already considering, that access to DSI is the same as access to genetic resources. In this case, of course, would be how access and benefit sharing happens will be depending on the national legislation and would be subject to pick and mat. So the utilization of DSI in this option would be regulated by MAT, mutually agreed terms, and would include also the benefit sharing obligations. So in this case, mutually agreed terms would be negotiated for each DSI access. Every time you access a DSI, you negotiate a MAT. So as I said before, according to the study on ABS measures that was commissioned for the ATEC and that you can find available in the website for the ATEC, some countries are already including DSI within the scope of their ABS measures, and some are actually following that approach. So the definition of genetic resources encompasses DSI, therefore the same rules apply. So the consequences of this option would be, for example, for researchers, when they access DSI through a database, if they want to comply with the ABS legislation, so I mean, in order to comply with ABS legislation, they would have to access DSI in database, and that DSI should be tagged with the country of origin of genetic resources. So they are able to trace back the origin and go to the national systems and comply with the ABS requirements in place. So if a researcher, in this case, uses multiple DSI from different countries, he or she would be required to comply with multiple and different ABS requirements for each country, and of course deal with the consequent multiple mutually agreed terms that he has negotiated. So you can always, as in the previous case, you can always look for more information in the materials referenced in the slide. Next, please. Option 2. Here we are dealing with standard mutually agreed terms. So the policy options that are clustered under this option have something in common. In all of these options, the obligation to share benefits is not linked to access to DSI, so there is no PIC. But the benefit sharing obligation arises after the DSI has been used. The obligation to share benefits could be triggered by determined events or milestones along the value chain. For example, upon commercialization of a product, or for example, when you commercialize a product, you have the obligation to share benefits resulting from the commercialization, or could be also upon granting of a patent that has been resulted from the use of DSI, a publication in a journal, depends of what is decided for the case. In these options, access is not restricted, but the obligation to share benefits remain and is determined by some type of standard mutually agreed terms. So you can call it mutually agreed terms, MAT, or you can call it licenses, SMTA, so standard material transfer agreements. The name can be different, but the idea is the same. It's a type of contract. The fact that the mutually agreed terms are standardized, what implies is that there is no individual negotiation of contracts for each DSI utilization, and instead you have one or more standard contracts or licenses that could be different for different cases or situations. So you could have a different license for non-commercial research, or a different license for a specific sector, or depends of what you decide, or following different criteria. However, the fact that you trigger the benefit sharing obligation along the value chain means that these policy options always might require a way of monitoring downstream use of DSI once that has been used. So the two sub-options that we talk about under option 2 in the standard MAT are to have some type of standard MAT at national level, and that will be also a bilateral mechanism, or some type of standard MAT at international level, and that would come where the benefits would flow to a multilateral mechanism. So these are the main differences of what we are going to explain now. The next slide, please. So this is, each country has a standard MAT, the national MAT. Under this option, each country would put a system of standard mutually agreed terms in place through their domestic legislation. So access will not be regulated, so no PIC again, but there will be a system of standard mutually agreed terms that users would need to comply with when the obligation to share benefit is triggered, like we were putting the example of upon commercialization. The benefit, once that the obligation is triggered, would be shared bilaterally with the country of origin. And for example, this is the example of the approach taken by the latest ABS measures adopted by Brazil. So if you want to know more how this could work at national level and the details, the nitty-gritty of operationalizing such a system, you can also go to the fact-finding study on ABS measures of the ATEC, and you will have a better description. And of course, you can find the whole ABS legislation of Brazil in the ABS clearinghouse. So in this policy option, researchers, when accessing DSI through a database, will need also to trace DSI back to the country of origin of the genetic resource. So they could, again, go to the national system and comply with the ABS requirements. So if the country information is not tagged in the database, the user would not be able to find that information of what are the ABS requirements that he has to follow. But again, if a researcher uses multiple DSIs coming from different countries, he or she would be then required to comply with multiple and different mutually agreed terms for each DSI access and each country. So a possibility, a type of a variant to this approach is the possibility of having a single standardized system for all countries that could be agreed at international level. So for example, would be the possibility of having a model legislation and a standard MAT, one or more standard MAT, that would be agreed at international level, internationally agreed, and that the countries will adopt and integrate into their national ABS systems. In this case, users would have to go still through the national systems, but the national system itself would be the same. So you would be always following the same rules and the same MATs, but through different channels. Other option would be to include the standard MAT or licenses in the DSI databases, where users, when they go and access a DSI, agree to share benefits with the country of origin in the cases that this country is identified in the DSI related data. So it has to be tagged the country. In this option, the user, instead of going through different national systems, they would have just a single, they would do everything. The relationship is almost within the database. So they have to, they wouldn't have to pass through the multiple national systems. And still, if the country is tagged, the benefits could be shared bilaterally with the country. So, I think this is, this is all. Sorry, I got lost.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. This was perfect. I will take over. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. So I will take over for the next sub option in the standard MAT one, and that's the one where the system is agreed upon at the international level. And so we are still talking about no regulation of access. There's no PIC, but there is standard MAT, just like with the bilateral option. But this time, the mechanism is multilateral. So it does not require tracing of the country of origin of the genetic resource from which DSI came from. And here, the benefit sharing is linked to the DSI data itself, just like the previous sub option. Basically, the idea is that the MAT one or several would be negotiated at the international level, and the benefit sharing would not go through each national ABS system like the bilateral option before was. So this would go into a multilateral fund, and the governance will be not discussed in this webinar, but will have to be agreed upon internationally, obviously. So the standard licenses could be negotiated at the international level and included into the databases of DSI. So with the same example coming back, but it's definitely not the only one, of whether the use of DSI is for commercial or non-commercial purpose. But obviously there would be many more terms in those MATs for benefit sharing and conditions. These standard MATs could be communicated to the user in several points along the value chain. The first option here is that it would be integrated into the DSI databases. And so when the user goes to download the DSI for their research project, the MAT would be attached to the DSI, and they would be informed of the terms and conditions for the use of the DSI they just downloaded. Another option would be to integrate it into the intellectual property systems. And this is related to the bounded openness option that that is in the literature and has been discussed in the literature. This is when users are informed of their obligations for benefit sharing when they're seeking intellectual property protection on the basis of a disclosure of the requirements on the use of DSI. So all the research until the intellectual property requirement, for example, filing for a patent or other intellectual property systems, until then, there is no benefit sharing restrictions on the DSI. But as soon as you want intellectual property for your product or your service, the terms and conditions kick in and the benefit sharing obligations are communicated to you. The users are the ones responsible for complying with the standardized license for each DSI access. So we can imagine that there could be several licenses. And so if you download a lot of DSI, you might have to comply with several licenses. However, if a single license is agreed internationally, that might not be the case. Also, for compliance, it would require a downstream utilization monitoring or tracking to know what happens to the DSI that gets downloaded from the databases and making sure everybody is aware of their obligations. And obviously, they would need a coordination with the relevant systems, maybe databases or the IPR system. We can also imagine that other points along the value chain of the use of the DSI could also be trigger points for the benefit sharing being communicated and the standard MAT to be communicated to the user. So you can see from the more information section that this is actually this sort of sub option of the standard MAT is being discussed a lot. And so we invite you to go and read up, because there are many variations within those this sub option that are being proposed in the literature. So this concludes the option 0, 1, and 2 buckets. And so we will kick in our first series of question and answers. I will ask Christina from the Secretariat to take the floor and facilitate the question and answer session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, first of all, we would like to thank everyone that submitted questions in advance and during the event. Due to the time constraints, we will not be able to address all of the questions, and we'll focus on those recurring questions and those most relevant to the content of this webinar. Please note that we will not be responding by email to questions. For more answers, we invite you to read all the materials that are being made available as part of the webinar. So we've got some more general type questions that have come in. Some I might ask in the second part of the questions, but I think we could start off with this one first question, and perhaps David would be the best person to answer it. So this has come up a couple of times, where people are asking, how can we be discussing policy options when we have not yet agreed on the scope of digital sequence information for genetic resources and terminology? Over to you, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina, and thanks to those asking this question. And of course, it's the issue really that the ATEG grappled with to a large extent and addressed. And this is really looking at the sort of chicken and egg situation between, identifying what we want to do with DSI and what DSI includes. You'll recall that earlier, the first ATEG identified a whole range of possible scope for DSI, starting at its most narrow with the DNA or DNA and RNA sequences, then looking and including perhaps protein sequences, looking at associated information and even traditional knowledge, and then knowledge about the place and the geography from where the original samples might have come. And, it was considered all of these things are relevant, but the parts that a particular policy option might apply to could be a subset of that. And these subsets are nested within each other. So really, we've got a bit of a sort of a tick-tock situation between the technical addressing what is considered as within the scope, and the policy in terms of determining then what you would be doing with that particular scope. So I think, I hope that the way the second ATEG addressed this, identifying various options for what may be considered within the scope, these nested within each other, in combination then with considering the policy options can be a useful way way forward and get beyond this chicken and egg situation or this catch-22 situation that we would otherwise be in. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. I have a question now that's related to the information that was shared by Beatrice. Some people are asking whether we have a sense of how many countries are currently addressing DSI in their national ABS measures. Beatrice, could you answer that question?
Yes, Cristina. Well, as I was mentioning, this fact-finding study that was commissioned for the ATEC, for the consideration of the ATEC, was doing a survey of how many countries had ABS measures in place for DSI. And one of the findings of the study was that a total of 16 countries have, and one subnational jurisdiction, have identified as having domestic measures in place for access or benefit sharing from DSI. In addition, there is 18 other countries that are planning to do so or are in the process of developing measures that cover DSI. For more information, the document, the study is in the website for the meeting of the ATEC. Thank you, Cristina.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. We have questions coming in, but they're more like comments on some of these policy options that we've presented. And like Charlotte presented earlier, we did not analyze these. We did not look at the legal basis of them. We just tried to use some of the criteria to organize these buckets of policy options. So therefore, we will not be responding to these questions that would require a more in-depth analysis of the merit, the legality. So unfortunately, those questions we will not be able to address. I'm going to move on to, there is a question regarding this whole idea of bounded openness. Charlotte, perhaps you could address this. Could you explain the concept a little bit better, maybe using some examples? Thank you.
I don't know if I can explain it better. I can explain it a little bit more in detail. Thank you very much, Cristina. And yeah, the bounded openness a policy option is one that is being talked about in the literature, and there's a little bit of mystery around it, but I'll explain the best I can. So the concept of bounded openness is one that has existed in other fields than, the application to DSI. It comes from the economics of information. And so the openness itself is linked to the fact that the data is accessible. The access is not restricted in any way, and everybody is free to go and use DSI for their own purpose at their own will. The bounded side of it means that there are terms and conditions that apply to the use of these DSI. So the policy option itself is presented by Rissmuller and Vogel, and I really invite you to go and read their papers. And there's a graphic that's actually really helpful to understand it, and it is posted in the information package on our website. So we invite you to go and dig a little bit deeper in it. The bounded openness here in this case, as presented by Rissmuller and Vogel, is one where the database is not included in the policy option. So the database stays as it is. It's open and free and accessible by all, etc. However, at the point of the intellectual property protection application, so a patent, for example, I think most are familiar with this system, but there are others depending on the sector of industry. At this point, you're being asked, did you use DSI or not in order to create your product or your service? And if the answer is yes, then you do have some obligations for benefit sharing that are being communicated to you. In the case of the papers and the work by Rissmuller and Vogel, the benefit sharing itself kicks in when the product or service is being successfully commercialized. That means that not only is the product actually created and starting to be manufactured and put on the shelves, but it also has to gain some net benefit. So the company has to make a certain amount of benefit from it, monetary benefit, and all these conditions, would be negotiated internationally, of course. But as soon as successful commercialization is achieved, a royalty would be due from the manufacturer or the producer, whatever the company, and be due to go into a multilateral fund. So this is the idea, as best as I can explain it. So thank you, Christina.
Thanks so much. No, that's great. And we've had a few people also ask something. This is going to be the last question in this round, and then we'll continue with the presentation and then have another round. But people are asking whether DSI related to human pathogens is something that would fall under the scope of the convention and this discussion in particular. So, David, maybe you could address this. David, are you there?
Thanks for all the easy questions. Yes, a broad understanding of the scope of the convention would include genetic material from pathogens, and indeed, a number of years ago, some countries in the World Health Assembly actually invoked the convention to indicate that they thought that needs to be better benefit sharing from the use of pathogens. In other words, that there should be more equitable access to vaccines and to other products that are derived from them. And in fact, that led in the World Health Assembly towards the development of the pandemic influenza preparedness framework, which does indeed provide for some benefit sharing approaches embedded in that framework. I should note also, of course, that as you know, the Nagoya Protocol also includes reference to the need for access and benefit sharing approaches to be cognizant of public health needs and to ensure that there is a speedy response so that any access and benefit sharing approaches that might be related to public health are dealt with in an expeditious way. So I think that's all I think we can say about that particular topic. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it now back to Charlotte to continue with the presentation, and we'll have another round soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. And so I think that you saw the slide that we put up during the Q&A, and it had the email address. So DSI webinar at cbd.int. And that is the email address you should address your questions to, and it's being monitored as we speak. So I will continue with the presentation. So we covered option buckets 0, 1, and 2 from our table. And we will move on to the option 3, which is also a very large policy archetype at a high level. And so, and there are 2 sub-options into this one. So let's go through how we pull those together into one big option archetype. So here, the access is still not restricted per se by PIC, but there's some type of payment or contribution that goes into a multilateral fund. However, there is no MAT like there was in the option 2 bucket. And therefore, there's no tracing of origin that is needed, but also no need to monitor the downstream utilization of DSI along the value chain. So the 2 sub-options here, 3.1 and 3.2, are basically split And one is a payment for access to DSI. And so the benefit sharing is linked to the DSI data itself. And the second sub option is other payments and contributions, but their commonality is that they are not linked to the DSI data itself. So let's jump into option 3.1. So we can see here at the top the criteria: no regulation of access, no PIC, no MAT. Like I just said, the mechanism is still multilateral. There is no need to trace the country of origin, and the benefit sharing is linked to the DSI data. It is an option that has been widely discussed as well in the literature, and there are many ways of applying this sort of concept to policy options. So the first arrow here in blue is the payment for access to the DSI itself, the sequence itself, right? And so here there's many ways that these payment options are discussed or proposed in the literature. And so we can here think about a membership fee for access to DSI in the database. Basically, the sequence information and associated data would be behind some type of paywall, I guess. And the fee would be determined following negotiated criteria. So, for example, always the same example: commercial versus non-commercial, but also sector of industry, sector of research, maybe the revenue of your company, or maybe just an annual fee or monthly fee that you would pay, sort of flat fee in order to be able to access the database. There are many variations around this, and I really invite you to go and read through some of these references. A second variation, I would say, in the payment for access to DSI is a payment to the individual DSI in the database. And that would basically be a very small fee. But this fee would be taken from some account or would be due as you download it. And this would be negotiated through, some type of standard licensing. This is how much you pay per DSI. And so the reasoning is that the more DSI intensive the research and development is, the higher the fee you would have to pay in order to access this DSI. Obviously, this would require work with the existing databases. And just as a reminder, there are private databases for which there's already some type of fee. And then there is the INSDC currently, which is public and does not require a fee. So we would need collaboration with these databases internationally, and those conditions would also need to be negotiated to be as fair and equitable as possible. The second arrow here in blue is an idea that's a little bit different, and it's basically a payment for access to the data associated with the sequence information itself. And so I guess that retraces back to the different buckets in the definition of DSI and playing a little bit with, what is DSI? Is it just the sequence? Is it the data? What is valuable? What is used? Etc. And so that requires further work, obviously, to really assess those questions. Here, the policy option is that the sequence information and maybe some very skeleton associated data, such as species name or collector name for the genetic resource or something, would be provided with no payment due. So able to download and use at your will. However, there is a lot of associated data when you go into databases and you download DSI. So you could have, for example, which amino acids this sequence codes for. and which protein does that produce in an organism? What are the properties of this protein? Is it a gene? Is it a gene, and are there introns? You know, there's a lot of research that really requires a lot of processing of the sequence data in order to make it valuable in a way, right? Depending on your field of research, obviously. But the idea here is that the value is not necessarily in the sequence itself, but in the data. So the product of somebody else processing the sequence information. And so the idea here would be that the associated data would be behind some type of paywall. So same thing, there are many ways of doing this, but the sequence itself would remain free. And so we know for a lot of research, you've heard from our academic colleagues and partners that the BLAST searches, and I'm not going to explain what it is, but it's very important for a lot of research. And so this would still be enabled freely without any payment. However, if you want something a little bit more intensive for your research or the development of a product, you would have to, you'd be subject to some type of payment. The second sub-option in the third bucket is basically all the same. Access is not regulated. There's no PIC, no MAT. The mechanism is multilateral. Therefore, the tracing back to the country of origin is not required. But however, the benefit sharing here are not linked to the DSI data itself, right? So there are many options, and some are very creative that have come out in the literature on this. And I invite you once more to read through them. There's more than what we listed on the slide. And you know, we're probably expecting more to come out as parties think through this and become creative in the ways of finding payment and contribution in a fair and equitable way, and also in a feasible way. So there's all these criteria that come into consideration when people think through these things, through all policy options, obviously. So here I'll just go through a few. So payment for DSI related services. This is the fact that once you download DSI, a lot of research uses large volumes of DSI and DSI data, and they need to store it, and then they need to use various bioinformatics tools, in order to process this DSI and make it useful for their research question or the development of a new product. And so the idea is that those services would be behind some type of paywall, would require some type of payment. And so here, cloud analytics, because the vast majority of these things are done on the cloud these days because of the volume of data and because of the computer power that is required to analyze those large volume of data. Another option is that the levies would be imposed on products or services associated with DSI. And if you go into the literature, a lot of people talk about micro levies, but there are different types of levies that exist and could be considered. Just one example amongst many, laboratory equipment. So when you have a genetic resource, you need to extract the DNA, sequence it, and then curate it and submit it to the database. It requires laboratory equipment and machinery, etc. And so in this case, the levy would be imposed on these purchases. But there are proposals for various micro levies and levies throughout the literature. The third one we'll go through here is the voluntary contribution to a multilateral fund. So this is entirely removed from the data or the data processing, and this is just sort of bypassing all these things and saying, you know, the private sector or, you know, some type of industry or the users of DSI in general, but also the parties would be able to contribute voluntarily to keep this DSI free and accessible and free of constraints. And this would go into a multilateral fund. Another one is the use of innovative financial tools. As one example, I put biodiversity bonds. Some of the literature really dives into this, and there are many financial tools that are very innovative and are currently being used in various international fora. And people are starting to think through these and seeing if it is applicable to DSI, does it make sense, is it feasible, etc. And so there's a lot of interesting literature that comes out from the finance world as well. Marketing program is one which you might be familiar with when you think about going to a store and buying some type of product. A lot of goods are sold under a type of marketing badge, and so it will it attaches a sort of value to the product through this badge. And so the idea is that the consumer would prefer to buy this product over a similar one that does not have the badge. So it is a marketing product. But attached to this badge is the commitment to actually share parts of the benefits from the sale of this product or service. Why not towards a multilateral fund? And this has been done. You can probably think of some of those in your daily life. And others, as I was saying, the literature, the authors are being creative. The literature is really searching for answers from all angles. And so we look forward to, more policy options. Once more, we're not claiming this is a menu of policy archetypes. This is just what we found in the literature that was available to us. So moving on to option 4. So here we move away from monetary benefits and into non-monetary benefits. And basically, it is about technical and scientific cooperation. It is about capacity building. And so I think this option is really reflecting the core of the Convention for Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol objectives. And so it is discussed, sometimes in depth and sometimes not, but it definitely appears in the literature quite a lot. So there is no pick and match, etc. The mechanism is multilateral in the sense that everybody would contribute to it and everybody would benefit from it. And obviously there is no tracing required. It's not linked to the data itself. It is an exchange of knowledge and expertise and collaboration. So here in this policy option, the capacity support for developing country is enhanced, is the word we used, in the sense that it becomes systematic and mandated by the policy. So there is a lot of capacity building and cooperation that is already taking place throughout the world and throughout the world of research, with DSI, but also in other research fields, but it is done in an ad hoc manner. It is really up to the person who has the funds or the expertise to build these cooperation and these technical and scientific exchanges, etc. Here, it would be part of a policy, so it's a little bit different. It's more intentional, I would say. We can think of many ways. Research collaborations, trainings. There was the idea of a knowledge platform that was discussed in the literature, where everybody contributes to the knowledge platform and everybody can benefit from it. Technology transfer and learning programs, etc. The goal here in this option 4 is that everyone should be able to build the capacity they need to take full opportunity of DSI and its benefits. This option is always in the literature presented as a supplement to other policy options. So that's the way this one goes. It is non-monetary, but it is significant in the literature. The last option is going to go quick, which is there are no benefit sharing from DSI. And so basically DSI is not considered equal to genetic resources with this option. And therefore there is no obligation to share benefits from its use. And so there is not much to say about this because there is no, sort of policy options trickling down from this one. This concludes the bucket 3, 4, and 5 from our table. So we have covered all 5 policy archetype options, and we will take now the second session of question and answers. So Christina, if you could facilitate this one as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thanks so much. So we've had quite a few emails flying in, and again, just to say, to reiterate, we can't get in. We're not getting into any analysis. For example, there was a question on whether we've assessed the negative impacts of some of these options, the feasibility. We haven't done that. We have taken what's in the literature, and we've tried to organize it to present it to you today. So maybe that's another step later down the road. And I'm going to ask some questions that have been coming in. I'm just looking at my screen here, sorry. So there's one question that's asking whether there's a tracing system currently in place or that's being proposed to track DSI. I'm wondering if, Charlotte, you could answer that really quickly. Charlotte, I think we've lost her. Hello? Beatriz? Beatriz, can you answer that question perhaps? I don't think the system is working right now. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. I can hear you.
I'm back. Oh, I'm back. Okay, sorry. I was clicking around and it's like, yeah, I can answer. So the question was about the tracing, right, of the country of origin. Thank you. I got a bit flustered here.
Well, if there's currently a system in place to trace or one that's being planned.
So the one that I know of, right, I'm not claiming that's the only one, is the one through the country, applying a country label inside the database. So when you go into a database and you want to look for DSI, you have the, there's a field in there which is country of origin or location of the genetic resource or something along these lines. And so the NSDC actually has it in its guidelines to include this. So hopefully you would include at least a country, hopefully even a little bit more, so you could see within the country which, territory you're on when you're collecting your genetic resource. However, the reality of it is that I think there's only, and I might be wrong here, but it's quite low. I think it's 12% of DSI in public databases is actually labeled with a country. There are efforts to retrace and geolocate those by linking the sequences to other databases that deal with biodiversity and museum collections, etc. However, at this day, researchers can technically submit a DSI with no country allocation. And unfortunately, most people still do that, even though the guidelines are that you should definitely have a country of origin. So there's room for improvement on this system, but it is what it is right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to ask Beatriz now to answer this question. In option 3.1, you say access is not regulated. However, there's a membership fee or payment for individual access. So this means access is regulated for those who pay. So there seems to be a contradiction. Can you address that, Beatriz?
Well, maybe it's just the use of terms of how we interpret the use of terms that we selected for this slide. When I was also, I'm a lawyer, so that's my vision of life. So when we are talking about access that is regulated, we mean like there is a type of control over the access. For example, if you when you have access control and you have a peak system, you can also say no to the access. So the fact that the access is unregulated doesn't mean that it's free. That's also sometimes that we discuss a lot in literature. Open access doesn't mean free access. So access is there. Maybe you have to pay a small membership fee to access the database, but we wouldn't say that is regulated in the sense of like control. So that, but I understand that the use of terms maybe is not perfect, but was difficult to find the fine line. Thank you, Cristina.
Thank you, Beatriz. I'm actually going to come to ask another colleague who hasn't appeared yet this morning. Matt, are you there? I hope you're with us. Just to make sure you're here. Okay, great, Matt. There's a question that's coming in about something that you're a bit more familiar with than the rest of us. So several of the policy papers mentioned blockchain, but this has not been touched on in the presentation. What is the relevance of blockchain in all of this?
Okay, thanks, Christina. Hello, everybody. Blockchain has been proposed in several of the papers as a potential tool to help monitor utilization. Blockchain is not a policy option itself, so it wasn't discussed, but it's one approach, one of many that can be used to help implement any of the options that do require monitoring the use of DSI. Blockchain is a mechanism, a tool that can keep a record of transactional data, so timestamp data in a very secure way. Blockchains have some interesting properties that can possibly make them useful to monitor the use of DSI, such as immutability. That means they're unchangeable. It makes them very difficult to be tampered with without everybody participating in the blockchain knowing. Another thing that makes them special is that they have no need for a central authority to be responsible to validate or verify any of the transactions in the blockchain. And another thing that's useful potentially for this kind of topic is they can also include something called smart contracts. So the idea proposed in the papers related to blockchain were not about storing the actual DSI itself in the blockchain, but they were to create a separate layer that monitors events and activities and even terms and conditions related to the user's use of the DSI. So these conditions and terms, specific terms and conditions can be built into smart contracts that the users could agree to, and they would be monitored as they use DSI throughout in this blockchain layer. I think one thing that's very important to consider when using a tool like blockchain is to bear in mind the actual requirements of what you're trying to do and the cost and energy implications. So
thanks Matt.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. There's been some questions raised about, what has been the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in this discussion, and how is DSI being treated that's linked to genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. I'm wondering if David, maybe you could address this question. David, are you there? Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yes, I'll try. As Tauco said in the beginning, we recognise clearly that indigenous knowledge is important, and also it's really important that indigenous peoples, local communities are engaged in this process to be sure that whatever options are eventually decided upon, that the views and the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities are taken into account. Of course, we have the issue of traditional knowledge. We also have the issue of traditional knowledge that's linked to particular genetic resources as specified in the Nagoya Protocol. The ATEG, when looking at the different categories, recognize that traditional knowledge is relevant and is useful, but would not probably constitute the DSI itself in terms of that is being shared. But clearly, you would want to make sure that traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources is still protected in the way that it should be through the convention and through the protocol. So it's difficult to give a very definitive answer on this, but other than to say really that it's vital that that indigenous peoples and local communities are fully engaged in this process and have the opportunity to be fully engaged in this process.
Thank you, David. I'm actually going to see if Tauco can join us now for a question. Maybe Tauco, don't put on your camera. I know you're having internet difficulties, but are you there?
You hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Right. Yes,
so this question is arised. The question is, in preparation for the webinar, have you considered all the possible options? Are there others out there? What can you say to that?
Well, as David just pointed out there, the issue of decay has not been adequately considered yet. And so this compilation of options is not exhaustive. Other options or combinations of options may be possible, but maybe they have not yet been formulated, or perhaps they are out there, but we have not been, they've not been brought to our attention. And it's therefore very important for us to stress that none of these options have been assessed or evaluated by the Secretariat. That means the assessment of the feasibility, the legality, the costs, etc. of the proposed options will need to be done by the parties themselves, ideally with a set of agreed criteria of their choosing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask a question that's coming up quite a bit. Beatriz, I'm going to ask you to address it. So the question is, please could you clarify the difference between option 0 and option 5? If DSI is not currently considered equal to genetic resources, does this mean options 0 and 5 are effectively the same?
Here I am. So just to remind everybody, which is option 0 and 5, option 0 is status quo. Is what we consider that is the situation now internationally, and in this situation, there is no agreement. Parties haven't agreed how to go about DSI. And as a result of that, some countries may decide to develop ABS measures and other things that there is no need. I mean, there is different views. So that's option 0. Option 5 is a situation where basically there is some type of recognition that there is no benefit sharing coming out of DSI. So this is a possibility, and some in the literature is also mentioned as a policy option. I hope that clarifies.
So Bea, just to kind of reiterate, so option 0 is the issue is unresolved. Option 5, it's resolved.
It's resolved.
Yeah. Okay.
Even though for some, option 5 is part of the status quo, but these are all policy negotiation positions, not, not so much. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we're running out of time. I think I'm going to ask one. Well, there are some questions for the co-chairs, but perhaps that will be answered later down when we present the next steps. And maybe this question, I can direct this to David. The question is, the whole idea of capacity development seems to be captured under option 4. Can you give some examples of how this could be combined with some of the other options? Over to you, David.
Yes, so the option on capacity development, or on, if you like, technical scientific cooperation is, how through international cooperation can we try and really help to level the playing field so that all countries are able to benefit from what we have, the access to DSI through these various platforms and the like. So we know at the moment, we have essentially open access to the platforms, but some countries are in a better position to make use of that than others. So this would be capacity building to try and resolve that. And clearly this could exist in combination with any of the other options, as is already the case, really. So this could be combined with, any of the other options. Perhaps it's more important with the latter options, where there is where you're delinking the genetic resource, or the DSI derived from the genetic resource, from the country that receives the benefits. But in the end, that's for parties to consider in the negotiations. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We're gonna close now the Q&A, but just to thank everyone for sending in your questions and your comments. We're not able to address them, but we will be looking at these carefully moving forward for the work that the Secretariat will be asked to continue supporting on DSI. So we thank you very much for your comments and your questions. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Christina. I'm actually just here to give the floor to someone else. So to cover the points of consideration that everybody should try and keep in mind, and that are really useful in considering those different policy options and policy archetypes, I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Shikongo. So Tauko, over to you.
Thank you, Charlotte, once again. As Charlotte pointed out, there might be issues that we need to consider, which we call general considerations, as we go through these options. And I'll briefly go through them. Parties could decide to combine different options. That means, for instance, providing for the sharing of monetary benefits as well as non-monetary benefits, or having voluntary contribution to complement mandatory sharing of benefits. Now, what we must keep in mind is that a hybrid solution, or even a combination of more than two of the policy options presented, might be a way to satisfy various parties with various mechanisms already in place. We must keep in mind that there is various capacities at the national level, as well as various needs. Also, it may ensure that whatever system in place is feasible in the sense that it has a positive cost to benefit ratio. Next slide. So bilateral sharing requires being able to trace DSI back the country of origin, or tagging in databases. Another one we have to consider is that we have to ensure compliance by users of DSI. That can be difficult for some of the options, and there are proposals to change existing practices in DSI databases, and these are dependent on those databases and their users adhering to those changes. And a multilateral approach requires a governance structure and a system for receiving and distributing benefits. Taking into account that in this webinar, we didn't look at things like a governance structure. And we need to invite people to see the ABS initiative video that was released, because that would give you an idea of some of those criteria that has come up. The last slide. We also take note that some options can have a high transaction cost, and upfront cost access fees could also impact innovation and research. We must keep in mind that if different obligations are established for commercial and non-commercial users of DSI, questions may arise on how to address the change of intent through the value chain. And one very important one is, all of them are important, is the time lag to start generating and receiving benefits may be certain and short for options where payments occur at the time of access, or uncertain and long for options where the benefits are shared upon commercialization. And as we said, the ABS Capacity Development Initiative have come up with some criteria that one can consider. Others has also come up with that, and we would invite parties and stakeholders to look at those videos and criteria for you to just then prepare as you go further with this issue of DSI. And then, so finally on this, risk and opportunities are there for each of the options. These must be assessed, or they need to be assessed. A full assessment of these options would reveal the pros and cons of each, and the trade-offs and general feasibility of each option. The co-chairs will consider how best to move this forward with the parties, and that will then inform our work going forward. Again, please watch the ABS initiative video on criteria for policy options. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Tauko. Sorry. Next slide. Yeah, so we were, Tauko was just telling you about the ABS Capacity Development Initiative in the video. We also wanted here to let you know about some activities that are coming up from their end. And these activities are in the context of the Norway-South Africa partnership and are supported by those countries. And so you might remember that they had a first global dialogue on DSI, which took place in Pretoria. And so in order to go from this webinar, so the last in the series on DSI, up to the second global dialogue, which is an informal dialogue on DSI. There are several events that are leading up to this, especially since it's, we can't meet in person, etc. these days. So coming up fairly soon, there's going to be a panel discussion on the outcomes of this webinar, the co-chairs webinar on DSI. So it's going to be lots of good things said about this webinar, and you'll be able to discuss and have your views and opinions and comments in a discussion group. Another one coming right after is going to be a series of discussions on capacity building needs, intellectual property systems, IPLCs, traditional knowledge, very importantly, like we've been saying, commercial use related to the creation and also to the use of DSI. So we encourage parties to take place in those discussions, talk to your stakeholders and read the papers and get your own questions ready and opinions to be discussed in those activities. A little further, the second global dialogue on DSI, once more an informal dialogue, will take place, and it will have a slightly different format because of restrictions of travel. And so there will be a global introduction, 3 separate discussions to accommodate the three different time zones so everybody can participate, and then a global plenary. And those will be to discuss the policy options and the decision-making criteria themselves under Chatham House rules just like the first dialogue. The outcomes will be shared, and the timing will correspond basically to the ability to integrate those and inform the third meeting of the open-ended working group on DSI, which is currently planned for August. There are here, let's get to the nice slide. The Secretariat for the CBD is really here to support the parties. So if you have events, if you are organizing webinars, informal discussions, etc., please communicate it with us. We would love to attend as observers, and we would love to be able to share this with other parties so they can also benefit from your efforts. And we'd like to engage and keep engaging in formal discussions with all our parties on this issue. And so please don't hesitate to contact us. This is what we're here for. So communicate, basically, is the best thing. I will now thank you all very much for your attention and your time. And I will leave the closing remarks to Mr. Basile Van Avre, the co-chair of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So thank you very much from me. And Mr. Co-chair, the floor is yours.
Merci, Charlotte. Thank you to all of you. I think I wanna reflect a little bit on what we saw today and talk a little bit about how the various pieces will come together. What we saw today is a comprehensive list of all the options we can think about. Yes, Tauco said there is more and there is more to be done, but you've got the main point on the table here, and those are going to be the dimension of the discussion. Once again, some are mutually exclusive, but some could be combined. So it is going to be about finding the right assemblage. We will go through the evaluation of the options, but we're going to see that some have significant logistical challenge, others some other challenge. Some may not provide very much value, but some will have the right combination and the right ratio of cost and benefits. Perhaps it is important that we keep in mind what's going to be practical solution that enable to advance. And if some are thinking that the status quo is going to get us anywhere, let me be clear, I don't think so. So it is going to be important to focus on those options that are realistic. And the question I have for you is whether it would be best to spend most of our energy and precious time on option 1 to 4. So that being said, Francis and I will be working with the Secretariat and the Bureau to find the right opportunity to have discussion in advance of Open Working Group 3. Those discussions should be focusing in my mind on what I just talked about, the what is your assessment of the value, merits, and cost of the various options, and how we can assemble a package that would make things progress. So we'll keep you updated on that. Though the work we've been doing today, the work has been doing in the Secretariat-sponsored webinars, as well as in the other forum that were sponsored by others, we'll all need to come back together, and we'll all need to move to the open-ended working group 3. You heard a minute ago about the work that South Africa and Norway are doing, and we're going to be talking with those and others that are sponsoring webinars in terms of making sure that they make those submissions available to parties in a timely way so they can be used to their maximum potential. I encourage you again to participate into that. There was lots of rich, and I'm looking forward to see all the questions. And if you feel that you want to comments to Francis and I about the process for this, about how we can do better in terms of organizing the right discussion, we're quite open to that. Tell us, we're working for you, we're working for nobody else. So we're happy to do that. So once again, thank you very much for your participation. Very, very happy, and I'm sure Francis would have loved to be here. And then back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Basile. And this is the end of the webinar, basically. So thank you all for your participation, your time and attention. We look forward to talking with the parties on this issue in the future and to having to seeing you all at more events, both informal and formal. So with this, have a very good day, good evening, good night for some of you, and goodbye.